Hi, everyone. Welcome to our event, Evidence in Action, Reducing Racial Wealth Gaps Through Effective Support for Public Higher Education. Today's event is hosted by the Institute for Research on Race and Public Policy at the University of Illinois at Chicago and the Center for Tax and Budget Accountability. The event is also co-hosted by the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy in partnership with the Office of Management and Budget. My name is Dina Lewis. I use she, her pronouns, and I am an associate director with the Institute for Research on Race and Public Policy. Before I begin introductions, I would like to do some audience housekeeping. We are recording the event. It will be shown on CAN TV, a Chicago-based public TV station, and on the CAN TV YouTube page. We will post it on IRRPP's website at irrpp.uic.edu. We are using Zoom's version of live transcription to caption this event. Although it is getting better, it's still not the best, and we apologize for any mistakes. The Q&A function is open. Please add your questions there. The chat function has been disabled for the audience, but we will be dropping links in the chat for you. Today, it's my pleasure to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Christina Chaka-Eller. Dr. Chaka-Eller, a scholar of institutions, organizations, and social inequality, is an assistant professor of sociology and social studies at Harvard University. She currently serves in the Biden administration as Assistant Director of Evidence in Policy in the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy. I'm going to turn it over to her now.
Thank you so much, Dina, for that very kind introduction. Thank you all so much for being here today. It's absolutely my delight to welcome you to this event, which is, I believe, the 7th of our Evidence Forum series that is part of the Year of Evidence for Action over at the White House. So I just want to start by giving a tremendous round of thanks to our colleagues at IRRPP and CTBA for hosting this event, which is on a topic that couldn't be more poignant today: racial wealth gaps and effects on higher education inequality. On a personal note, I'm just absolutely delighted to hear from the colleagues that will be speaking today. They are absolutely incredible scholars and colleagues and really leaders in this space. And so thank you so much to Dina, to Allison, to Amanda, and to Ralph for making this happen. I just wanted to say a quick couple of words about this whole Year of Evidence for Action thing in order to frame out our conversation today. So, as some of you may know, we launched the Year of Evidence for Action at a White House summit back in April. It's really hard to believe that we're about halfway through this year of evidence, but we are also very excited that we've gotten quite a bit done. We developed this Year of Evidence because the Biden-Harris administration is deeply committed to advancing evidence-based policies that really make equity a central priority. We see this commitment in presidential directives, in regulation and guidance that allows and encourages agencies to make use of federal funds for evidence building and evaluation, and in the day-to-day activities of dedicated leaders inside the federal government who really work every day to strengthen and expand our evidence-based approaches with an understanding of how equity should be central to all of these. As President Biden wrote in his Week 1 memorandum on restoring trust in government, scientific and technological information, data, and evidence are central to the development and iterative improvement of sound policies and to the delivery of equitable programs across every area of government. I think that the president's words are both compelling and clear in that it's an opportune moment for building and using evidence in the federal government, and also that equitable evidence, equitable programs are the goal really of deploying our research knowledge. Evidence is a funny word. And so let me just say, for an audience that perhaps is mixed in terms of kind of your home affiliations, and because I had to learn when I was moving into federal government, evidence basically means our research. When we talk about evidence-based policy, we're talking about using the insights that are coming from systematic learning about the world and investing those insights into our decisions about programs and policies in governmental structures. And so while something that might be quite vague, this evidence thing to communities that are not as familiar, really what the federal government is talking about when it talks about evidence-based policy is making it possible for our research to enter into government decision-making processes. So this is actually quite good news for all of us. I want to just say a couple quick words about what the goals of this whole year of evidence have been. They've been to share leading practices from federal agencies to generate and use research-backed knowledge to advance better, more equitable outcomes, to strengthen and develop new strategies and structures to promote consistent evidence-based decision-making inside the federal government, and to increase connection and collaboration amongst researchers, knowledge producers, and decision makers inside and outside of the federal government. And it's this evidence forum series that we kind of are part of today that's really helping to make good on that third piece of the equation, increasing connection and collaboration amongst folks inside and outside of the federal government in service of really getting to better, more equitable outcomes for the American public. I just also wanted to, since we have this nice audience, I wanted to share a couple of other things that are going on that might be of interest to this group. First, my office, the Office of Science and Technology Policy, a few months ago rechartered what we call the Social and Behavioral Sciences Subcommittee of the National Science and Technology Council. A decent amount of alphabet soup, but basically this is a committee that is formed with members from federal agencies across the federal government to think about how we are generating and using social and behavioral science insights in our federal practices and policies, laying the groundwork for longer-term coordination of agency efforts related to these topics. There's actually a brief online on our OSTP website that talks about how we're conducting ourselves and also the 5 priority areas that are kind of front and center in our work process. And those include things like equitable communication of hazard information and uncertainty, decarbonization and justice, enhancing re-entry following incarceration, and several others. And so these are really areas where we're working really hard inside the federal government, and the social science community has come together. And we'd be absolutely delighted to have more insights coming from the community outside of the federal government. For that reason, we have an inbox that it's secret, goes to my email, but we have to have a general inbox. That's sbs@ostp.eop.gov. If you're interested in the work of this group, you want to learn more, or you want to share your insights, please do send a note, and we can have our colleagues at IRRPP and CTBA share that out too. The second thing is that there is a new funding pilot that our colleagues at the National Science Foundation are leading out on called the Analytics for Equity pilot. And this is a first of its kind initiative that is going to distribute targeted funding from NSF to external research teams who submit proposals to directly address federal agencies' priority learning questions. There's going to be a broad agency announcement or a funding call for this pilot later in the fall. And it's just really exciting to know that that kind of funding is going to become available. There's a website, Analytics for Equity Initiative at NSF, that you can also locate. I'm going to turn it back to Dina, but I also want you to know that if you're looking to have more information about how the government is thinking about evidence evaluation, equity, and all related issues, you should go to evaluation.gov. This is kind of the central hub for these issues across the federal government, and I didn't know about that website before I jumped on the inside. So I commend it to you all and hope that you will please visit it and see what we're up to. And without further ado, let's get ourselves started. Dina, thank you so much.
Thank you so much for that framing. And as we're going, I'm going to briefly introduce our speakers. We will be dropping links in the chat. We will have this information available after the event. And I really suggest that you click on these links to learn more about the amazing work our speakers are doing, because my brief intros won't do them justice. So I want to introduce our next three speakers, and I'm going to start first with Ralph Martiri, who is the Executive Director at the Center for Tax and Budget Accountability and the Arthur Rubloff Endowed Professor of Public Policy at Roosevelt University. He has helped and worked with CTBA to obtain numerous legislative successes, and I'm just going to name a couple here. So those successes include passage of the evidence-based model of education funding in FY18 and a state earned income tax credit, and that's just only a few. After Dr. Martiri will be Amanda Lewis, Director of IRRPP and Distinguished Professor of Black Studies and Sociology at the University of Illinois, Chicago. Dr. Lewis's research focuses on how race shapes educational opportunities and on how our ideas about race get negotiated in everyday life. With Dr. Lewis will be Fructuoso Bazaldua, a third-year doctoral student in the sociology department at UIC. Fructuoso is interested in studying racial inequalities and is currently studying the intersections and connections between the privatization of public higher ed, student loan debt, and racial wealth inequality. So now I'll turn it over to Dr. Martiri, who will then turn it over to Dr. Lewis and Fructuoso. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. I am Ralph Martiri. I'm Executive Director of the Center for Tax and Budget Accountability, as you just heard. And one thing that's interesting about our organization, next slide, please, is that we're a think tank that is actually bipartisan. That means my board of directors literally has Democrats and Republicans on it that don't really like or trust each other very much at all. But that's awesome for the organization because it allows us to work on our mission, which is focused on fostering social and economic justice through evidence-based best practice public policies that have adequate capacity to satisfy demographically driven needs. This is why we're so honored to be working today with the IRRPP, the White House, the distinguished panelists, taking this evidence-based approach to dealing with major societal issues and major systems reform at the public sector level is really an effective way to come up with a public system that really meets the needs of all our citizens, irrespective of their race, their ethnicity, their income, their gender, et cetera. We do focus at the CTBA on fiscal capacity for one real simple reason, right? If you have inadequate funding on the front end, inadequate capacity on the front end, you will get inadequate outcomes at the back end. And this is frequently not part of the discussion when we come to analyzing public sector services. Everyone just says, gee, we don't like the outcomes we're having. Maybe the government ought to do more with less. A lot of rhetoric builds up around it. But the bottom line is the rhetoric doesn't match the reality. If you don't make an adequate investment in your core public services on the front end, you won't get the outcomes you want on the back end. Next slide, please. So the way we go about our work is to really take a serious stab at producing evidence and data-based research that identifies not just where the problems are in core public system, education, whether it's higher ed, K-12, et cetera, social services, whatever. We not only identify that, but we also identify the best practices that are designed to actually redress the challenges that we see from the data, whether it's structural racism and how schools are funded. This is something we found, by the way, in the state of Illinois, or whether it's other inequities that pop up in the data. You find the best practices that you need to implement at the public sector level to resolve these inequities. And then you work with community partners, with legislators, with educating the media, educating the public, so that everyone understands that what you're doing is implementing an evidence-based reform that's really designed to make a difference. Next slide, please. One way we've been able to do that, it was mentioned in my intro, was pass what's called the evidence-based model for school funding reform in Illinois. And in this model, you could look at the data that's up here on the slide. This model has been tremendous for actually redressing past inequities. Of the $1.5 billion that has gone into enhanced K-12 funding by the state of Illinois since the model passed, literally or 1.3 billion has gone to educating 75% of our Black kids and 71% of our Latinx kids. That's the reverse of how funding used to go under the old model. Now, the way we were able to get this done, working as technical advisors with the Black Caucus, was to focus on the evidence underlying the approach. What this model does is it ties the amount of K funding into a school district, covering the costs of those research or evidence-based practices that have actually been shown to enhance student achievement over time. And that was crucial, right? Because what it allowed us to do was to bridge the ideological divides that frequently get in the way of passing transformative legislation that deals with these core societal issues. We were able to get moderate to conservative thinking worldview individuals in both parties, quite frankly, support this very progressive approach to dealing with historic inequities because we focused on the evidence. So what does the evidence tell us about higher ed? Next slide, please. It says a number of things. From an individual standpoint, I mean, it's very clear that getting a college education is really a necessary element to be competitive in the modern economy. Current estimates jump all over the place, but they're anywhere from 62 to 75% of all new jobs require a college degree. Gaining a post-secondary degree is very highly correlated both with enhancing social and economic mobility, as well as reducing wage gaps. And these correlations have only grown over time. And so, while getting a college degree doesn't guarantee anything, great job, et cetera, not getting a college degree in the current economy really creates problems for an individual from their standpoint in becoming an active member of the modern economy that actually has the opportunity to earn a decent income. Next slide, please. Also, from a societal standpoint, we know that investing in higher education actually generates a significant rate of return at the private sector level. And in fact, Moody's Analytics, a relatively conservative bond rating agency, really found that the biggest bang for the buck overall when it comes to the public sector enhancing private sector activity isn't through tax cuts or anything like that. It's the converse. It's investing adequately in core services that really build human capital. In fact, I think the way we should be looking at higher ed going forward is that it's truly a public asset that merits a major public investment, because it helps produce a really good economic rate of return. Now, what is some of the specific data that we've been relying on to make these sort of assertions? Next slide, please. Well, there you go. Straight line basis, whether you're talking about the nation or Illinois, you can see the lower your level of educational attainment, the higher your unemployment rate, and the higher your level of educational attainment, the lower your unemployment rate. Next slide, please. We also know that there's a significant correlation between educational attainment and wage. And here you could see that top line, that gray line you see across the graphic, that's the median weekly earnings of someone that has a bachelor's degree. Look how much higher that is than someone with just some college or an associate's degree or a high school grad. I mean, really, the time when you could just sort of graduate high school and get the kind of job that guarantees you could put a car or two in the garage and a kid or two through college is over. And what you really need to do is develop those skills at the K-12 level that are necessary for you to be successful at the higher ed level. And then the public sector needs to recognize that this correlation exists and start making a greater investment at the higher ed level than what it's been making in the past. Next slide, please. I think this one is really compelling. It takes a long-term look at what's been going on in the economy and the correlations with learning. And what you could see is people with either just less than a high school diploma, a high school degree, but no college credit, no college degree, or some college, are actually earning less today in real inflation-adjusted terms than they earned way back in 1979. And the only cohort of workers that has seen a real gain in their incomes after you adjust for inflation are those that have a bachelor's degree or higher. And adjusting for inflation is really a core way to look at these really significant long-term trends in our economy. If you don't adjust for inflation, if you don't have a real comparison, you're not looking at apples to apples. And that's always something that's a prescription for designing poor public policy remedies. Next slide, please. Finally, this slide on the correlation between the wage gap between workers that have a bachelor's degree or higher, and high school earners, I think is just compelling. That gap back in 1979 was 38%. So someone with a college degree was earning 38% more than someone with just a high school diploma. By 2022, that had jumped up to being 85% more. I mean, this data is compelling and there's just no way around it. Next slide, please. There's also a correlation between educational attainment and upward mobility. Brookings did a really wonderful study a few years ago that found only 13% of those folks who were born into the bottom earnings quartile who did not get a college degree were able to escape that earnings level and reach one of the top 2 earnings quartiles by the time they were 40. However, 40% of the individuals born into that bottom earnings quartile who did get a college degree were able to move up into one of the top earnings quartiles by the time they were 40 years old. Getting a college degree is a real powerful way to enhance upward mobility. Next slide, please. And then I talked about the ROI. You know, Moody's Analytics found that generally speaking, if you make an investment in core public services that really invest in people, you get more than $1 return for that investment, about $1.36. Well, a study was done on investing at the university level in the state of Illinois, and it found even better multipliers. I mean, sure, in McLean County, where the study was initially focused, there's a couple of universities, and they found a very similar multiplier, this $1.36 for every dollar in. That's an induced direct or indirect private sector economic activity. But the multiplier becomes much greater at the state level or in a big city level like city of Chicago, because there's less economic leakage. There's more of the economic inputs already there, whether it's statewide or in the big city. There, the multiplier jumped up significantly so that every dollar spent through a university generated $2.28 in economic activity. That's a powerful economic return. The state of Illinois is about to invest $2.2 billion in higher education this year, and that should generate $5 billion in private sector economic activity. Next slide. However, that said, Illinois really hasn't gotten the memo on how important higher ed is to both the private sector economy and to individual competitiveness in the modern economy. If you just go to that line on this graphic that shows the long-term comparison in investment in higher ed at the state level in Illinois, the far left column, you see higher ed got $2.1 billion in fiscal year 2000. 20 years ago. You adjust that amount for inflation, and to have just an equal funding level this year in 2023, the state would be needing to funding higher ed at $4.1 billion. It's not, it's funding it at 2.2. That looks flat almost in nominal dollars, but after you adjust for inflation, that's a 45% cut. That is a major cut, and that has had major consequences. Next slide, please. So back in 2003, the state of Illinois' grants to higher ed in higher ed public institutions in our state covered 74% of the cost of a student attending the university, whereas tuition and fees, what's called university income funds, only covered 25%. By 2021, because of this continued long-term disinvestment in the public asset of higher education, that had flipped. And so the tuition and fees were 64% of the revenue that the universities, public universities, were receiving in Illinois, whereas state grants were only 35%. And you can see how that compares to the national averages. We are worse than the nation in both of these areas. Next slide, please. And so this has really driven up tuition costs, which makes higher education far more difficult to afford for low to middle income families. And I think the data on changes in median income versus growth in tuition costs show it compellingly. If you look at the comparison in the left here, in Illinois, median income has gone up over the last 20 years by 15 points on an inflation adjusted basis, whereas the cost of attending a public university in our state has gone up by 115 points. You can see the change at the national level has also shown a growth in tuition and fee costs that vastly outstrips the growth in median income, but not nearly as bad as it's been in Illinois. And a lot of that is because of the disinvestment in higher ed you see in Illinois. Next slide, please. Now, of course, if you make higher ed more expensive, you're going to see a decline in enrollment, and certainly we've seen that. So over the last 11 years, we've seen full-time enrollment across the U.S. decline by 5%, in Illinois by 21%. Interestingly, in fiscal year 2021, 47 states actually realized a decline in full-time enrollment at their public university, and that's the greatest number of states on a year-to-year basis. That's the greatest number of states that's realized such a decline ever. So this is a big problem, and this problem has racial implications as well. Next slide, please. What you could see is average in-state tuition as a portion of median income by race and ethnicity. Go to these high bars. For African Americans, tuition is taking much more of their average median income than it is for your typical white family. And that's true in Illinois and in the nation, although a little worse in Illinois, once again, because of our significant disinvestment. Next slide. So if it's so much more expensive across racial and ethnic lines for minority students who are traditionally underrepresented in higher education to be able to afford going to university, what you're going to see is attainment by race at the post-secondary level will have some discrepancies. And sure enough, that's borne out in the data, taking an evidence-based approach, where you can see, just go to the bottom 9, the national data, which very much is tracked in Illinois, 52% of all whites aged 25 to 64 had gotten a college degree, but only 31% of Blacks, 27% of Hispanics, et cetera. So the disinvestment on the front end, which drives up costs for students, has had impacts along not just income lines, which everyone would assume, but also racial lines. And that's something that is curable if you start making a better investment in things like access to college by making grants more available to kids. Next slide, please. So we see that student debt, because the cost of attending a higher institutional learning is going up, student debt is a significant problem. And the data here speaks for itself. 12 years after taking out a loan, 59% of all students in the highest income quartile still had loans out, 91% of those in the bottom. Next slide, please. However, that's also had a racially disparate impact when you look at it. So according to NCES data, and this once again, compelling information, 12 years after starting college, the median white borrower still owed 65% of the principal of their loan. And that's not an insignificant amount. But actually, at the same time period, the median Black student loan borrower actually owed 13% more than their original principal balance. And so that's really something that needs to be addressed at the national level and at the state level with greater investment. And so President Biden, next slide, please, has made a welcome approach to dealing with these problems that's very rational and very evidence-based by offering to, cancel some student debt. This program, if it gets fully implemented, will really not only make college cost burden more affordable for low, moderate income families generally, it will really have a positive impact addressing those disparities we see along racial and ethnic lines, which is really positive. And so going forward, CTBA is going to be working on creating an actual funding formula in Illinois. Next slide, please. That is going to be focused on creating an adequacy-based approach to funding higher education in our state that will encourage more of the traditionally underrepresented students getting into and graduating college. And so this is a major step forward. We are going to utilize evidence to inform every step of this process. I really appreciate you all listening to me over this presentation and would like to turn this over to Dr. Amanda Lewis, who is smarter than me and ready to give you guys a really good presentation. Dr. Lewis.
Thanks, Ralph. I want to thank everybody for being here. Thanks to all the collaborators and some of my brilliant colleagues who you'll hear from in a minute. And also thank Christina and the folks from the Office of Science and Technology Policy. Ralph's brilliant work, the work of CTBA, is a great transition into this work that we've been doing for a while, where really we are focusing in some ways on the kind of racially disparate impacts of some of these policy changes that on their surface seem to be race neutral. at IRPP, we've been doing some work for a while trying to understand and capture racial dynamics in the city of Chicago. And as part of a series of reports we've been doing on the state of racial justice in Chicago, we published this report where we interviewed 99 middle-class families in the city to understand their experiences. This work was sort of initiated by two different data points that had come up in earlier work we've been doing that we were really curious about and concerned about. One data point, and this is data from the Corporation for Enterprise Development Racial Wealth Divide Initiative, showed that twice as many Black and Latinx as white households in the city were what we might call liquid asset poor. This 1/3 of Black and Latinx households had zero or negative net worth, which means functionally that they have no safety net in place for when they hit any of the regular road bumps of life. Another data point that struck us was from the Opportunity Insights Project, which showed that Black and Latinx children born to middle-income families in Chicago were far less likely than white children from families with the same income to remain in the middle class or to attain a college degree. These racial patterns in downward mobility among middle-class Chicagoans were much higher than national averages and raised important questions about the future of Black and Latinx communities in Chicago. Now, while these statistics on their own were really powerful, they couldn't provide us context for how wealth or lack thereof affects various aspects of folks' daily lives. And so an important goal of this report was to detail the lived experiences of the racial wealth gap for families in Chicago. And as I said, we interviewed members of 99 Black, white, and Latinx families to understand how they were faring and how they're making sense of their experiences. I want to show you two other kind of national patterns quickly for those who might not be familiar with the data and the scope of racial wealth gaps. As you can see from this table, they are large. They're one of the largest points of racial inequality that we see in data on race and ethnic dynamics. They've also gotten larger in recent years. Decades of research have demonstrated that they result primarily from intergenerational transfers of resources. They aren't a result of savings rates. They aren't about individual consumption patterns, but result from the ways that resources get passed along across the life course. As scholars Melvin Oliver and Tom Shapiro talked about, they represent the way the past has a living effect on the present. And as we're going to be talking about today, how those inequities are often exacerbated by current policies. While education, as Rolf was talking about, is in many ways a path towards upward mobility, national data shows that the racial wealth gap barely decreases when comparing white, Black, and Latinx individuals with a college degree. That is, everybody does better with a college degree, but the racial wealth gap persists. Whites with a college, white people without a college degree still have a median net worth higher than Black and Latinx families with a college degree. And the gap actually gets bigger the more education folks get. Okay, so overall, now shifting to this study we did, I want to talk about the sample. We interviewed folks from households who fit the popular image of middle-class families in a major metropolitan area like City of Chicago. They were college educated, they had higher median family incomes, they were mostly homeowning, they were parents. And these are folks who, at least in popular discourse, have really made it. And they are, in fact, responding in some ways to the kinds of data that Rafa shows that shows the importance of getting a college degree in order to kind of live a middle-class, stable life. However, as this slide captures, many of them were really struggling financially. What they talked about, what we see from a kind of expansive research literature, is that there are many different experiences of being middle class. Many of our respondents talked about being middle class, but not feeling middle class. And what you can see from these different categories we created is that a majority of the Black and Latinx respondents we interviewed were either in the category we labeled financially vulnerable or treading water. What these meant was the financially vulnerable folks were folks who couldn't even manage to pay their monthly bills, that their debt was increasing as they couldn't quite make ends meet from month to month. Folks who were treading water could cover monthly costs, but had very little left over to save for the future, either for retirement or for their kids' education, et cetera. And those who were able to do both, we labeled as stable. Many of these people were actually what we would think of as financially thriving, but you can see the real racial differences for the folks we interviewed in where they landed and what their regular financial circumstances were. So despite earning higher median family incomes, Black, Latinx, and white respondents experienced dramatically different financial situations. And as Fructosa will talk about in a moment, their experience of how they paid for college was a key factor here. Intergenerational transmissions of resources I talked about are, many have talked about, a main driver of wealth gaps. Wealth clearly begets wealth, and families who have more are able to pass along more. However, we often mistakenly assume that most of these cash transfers take the form of inheritances and forget about the regular support and cash transfers that happen throughout the life course. And one of the biggest racial disparities we found was in who received support for paying for college. This was not about which families valued education, but about which families had the money to provide help. In general, the white respondents we spoke to, as is true of white households nationally, as you saw from that data, were much more likely themselves to come from middle-class families and come from families that had a reserve of resources to help pay. And I will turn it over to Fructosa now to show how these resources differences had consequences for folks in terms of their financial trajectories over time. Fructosa.
Perfect, thank you very much. So drawing attention to how the wealth gap is an intergenerational family affair, this slide here draws attention to how the disinvestment of public higher education, as Ralph explained, has had a disproportionate negative impact on Black and Latinx families' ability to pay for college. So as you can see in our study, there were significant inequalities in who received full financial support from their parents for their college education by race, with white respondents being far more likely to have received support. Next slide, please. So here's a quote from Reagan, a white respondent in her late 30s, whose parents paid for her undergraduate education in full. As you can see, Reagan's quote highlights how having full financial support for college enhanced her college experience. And moreover, as shown on the last slide, Reagan's experience was not uncommon, as 61% of white respondents in our study received full financial support. Next slide, please. The positive benefits of receiving family financial support in college, however, extended far beyond the immediate benefits experienced while in college, as this quote from Hannah shows. Poignantly alluding to intergenerational wealth, as you can see, she says, when you start out ahead, you get a lot farther, a lot faster. It's important to note that Hannah's experience was also not uncommon, as white respondents who received full financial support for college were most likely to be in the stable financial category, as well as be on positive wealth building trajectories. Next slide, please. So the next slide draws attention to the other side of the racial wealth gap. And as you can see, a lot of Black and Latinx respondents were much less likely to receive financial support for college. So 50% of Black respondents and 71% of Latinx respondents did not receive any financial support. Next slide, please. So here's a quote from Imani, a Black respondent in her late 30s. As you can see, neither Imani or her husband received any financial support from their parents for their undergraduate education, nor have they received any financial support at any point in their adult lives. This experience was also something that was not uncommon for Black and Latinx respondents, as the majority did not receive financial support for college. Next slide, please. So given the racial inequalities in Black, Latinx, and white families' ability to pay for college due to racial wealth gaps, we also found that racial inequalities who had and held student loan debt, or we also found that there were inequalities in who had and held student loan debt, with Black and Latinx respondents being much more likely to be in debt and to be holding more debt. As such, we found that having and holding student loan debt had a significant negative impact on Black and Latinx respondents' ability to build wealth over time. Next slide, please. So here's a quote from Jasmine, a Black respondent in her late 30s. So as you can see, Jasmine describes paying her student loan debt as taking water out of a bathtub with a syringe, as she expressed frustration at the fact that she had not made significant progress paying off her debt, despite making consistent payments on them for 12 years. Next slide, please. So Jasmine, like Salvador, a Latinx man in his mid-30s, and like many other respondents with student loan debt, struggled to build wealth over time. And here's a quote from Salvador describing his financial situation, saying, "Juggling, it's just juggling. It's just damage control, because obviously I'm not building wealth, I'm just trying to juggle the debt." Next slide, please. So the aforementioned quotes from our report in juxtaposition show how the racial wealth gap persists as an intergenerational family mechanism. And moreover, the quotes draw attention to how changes in how public higher education is funded exacerbates and sustains the racial wealth gap intergenerationally, given that the same respondents, mostly Black and Latinx, who did not receive financial support for their undergraduate educations, were now struggling to save money for their own children's college education. Next slide, please. And then next slide.
Sorry.
One more back. So as Jasmine shared, it's very different if you're 25 and you graduate from college with no student loan debt, and then your parents give you a down payment on your first house. That sets you up totally differently than a 25-year-old with student loan debt, not having any financial backing or safety net. And so your first job out of college, you're paying all the bills. Next slide, please. And then lastly, this slide here draws attention to the racial inequalities we found in our respondents' ability to save for their own children's college funds. As you can see at the bottom, white respondents were much more likely to have started a college savings for their children, whereas Black and Latinx respondents were struggling to do so. Next slide, please. So in conclusion, while declines in funding for public higher education may seem like a race-neutral policy shift, they actually have a significant differential racial impact. And the primary reason why they have a differential racial impact is because of historic and contemporary racial wealth inequalities, which significantly shape the ability of different families to fund college. Thus, when states retract from public higher education and families are pushed to fund increasing shares of the funding formula, this exacerbates existing and well-documented resource differences.
Thanks. We'll turn it back over to Dina.
Great. Thank you all for that helpful framing. And so after that framing, that important framing, we're going to move into our panel. So I'm going to introduce all of our panelists and they'll go in order. After that, we'll have a short discussion. So I would like to introduce Matthew Soldner, who is the Commissioner of the National Center for Education Evaluation and Regional Assistance with the U.S. Department of Education. Some of Dr. Soldner's expertise include innovative practices designed to improve student outcomes after high school, post-secondary competency-based education, and federal financial aid. After Dr. Soldner will be Devin Fergus, who is the Arvar E. Strickland Distinguished Professor of History, Black Studies, and Public Affairs at the University of Missouri, and is currently the Charles Warren Visiting Scholar at Harvard University. Dr. Fergus's research focuses on race, political economy, and inequality in modern America. Next will be Laura Hamilton, who is Professor of Sociology at the University of California, Merced, and co-founder of the Higher Education, Race, and the Economy Lab, also known as the HERE Lab. Dr. Hamilton examines the ways that colleges and universities work to create and maintain racial, class, and gender inequity and how to break these patterns. Finally, we will hear from Louise Seamster, who is Assistant Professor in Sociology, Criminology, and African American Studies at the University of Iowa. One line of research Dr. Seamster examines racial disparities in debt and debt markets, including predatory inclusion in student debt and the different meaning of debt for Black and white families. So it's my pleasure to turn it over to Dr. Soldner.
Hey, thanks, Dina, and thanks, everyone. It is my privilege and pleasure to be with you all today. I want to spend some time talking to you, kind of pulling forward some threads that Christine introduced, talking about evidence building in this area as a team sport. So just to give you a bit of a roadmap for the presentation today, I'll start by telling you a bit about how we think about the process of evidence building at the U.S. Department of Education. And then I'll transition into talking about these studies, their relationship to our work here at the department, and then a specific ask I hope I can make of each of you. And then we'll spend just a few minutes looking ahead. So just so you know kind of my perspective and where I sit inside the department, I am lucky enough to have two hats. On the left side of the slide, one hat is here, as Dina mentioned, in our Institute of Education Sciences. IES is the department's autonomous, objective, nonpartisan research, statistics, and evaluation group. There are 4 centers in IES, and I have the privilege of leading our National Center for Education Evaluation. But on the right side of the slide, you'll see I also have the privilege of being the department's chief evaluation officer with a somewhat different role. And that role charged with enabling evidence building to support the agency's strategic plan and achieving our policy leadership's goals. We build evidence in that way in 4 different areas, what we call foundational fact-finding, program performance management and improvement, rigorous policy analysis, and program evaluation. And through a mix of grants that support field-initiated research and contracts that support government-directed research, we hope to execute against a broad evidence agenda I'm going to introduce you to today. To give you the bottom line up front, I really want to commend the prior speakers. The work that we have discussed so far today really demonstrates to me the power of high quality descriptive research, what we also call foundational fact finding, paired with thoughtful policy analysis. And in the last presentation, we also really saw the power of voice, how voice can add richness to our understanding of a situation, but also how it can begin to help us think about and build better hypotheses about how we might begin to develop policy solutions and support our fellow citizens. Needless to say, as Christina introduced earlier in the talk, the issues that all of our authors have already addressed are really top of mind to policymakers across the education department, and not only as it relates specifically to post-secondary education. And really importantly, the kind of work you just saw that was just shared with us really does represent the kind of evidence that federal and state policymakers can use to inform decisions that can positively affect the lives of learners, their families, and their communities, and that we desperately need more of. So here's the perhaps the key message from my time with you all today. Even with a formidable evidence-building enterprise at our disposal, the 4,000 colleagues of mine here at the Department of Education, we cannot, by ourselves, begin to generate the range of evidence that we need to inform our highest priority decisions. But with your help and the help of those in your networks, we can do more to bring high quality evidence to decision makers to inform their courses of action. So briefly, what are those priorities and where might you begin to fit into that evidence building architecture supporting policy making that can make a difference? For 2 years, or 2 years, right? For 20 years rather, the department really has been conducting rigorous, high quality evidence building. In fact, we're about to celebrate our 20th anniversary here at IES with the passage of the Education Sciences Reform Act of 2002. But with the passage of the Foundations for Evidence-Based Policymaking Act of 2018, an increasing amount of the evidence building we are doing, both in our department and government-wide across all federal agencies, really is meant to be focused on agencies' strategic plans, the things they expect to achieve over the next 4 years. So our strategic plan here at the Department of Education is available at performance.gov, another website that I would commend to you all. And if you go to performance.gov, you can see the 5 strategic goals the administration plans to focus on for the next 4 years, each accompanied by specific objectives. And then driven by those goals, we've developed what we call our learning agenda. It outlines the questions, the priority learning questions that we need to have answered if we truly are going to achieve the goals and objectives that have been set forward for us. And those can be found at evaluation.gov, which Christina mentioned earlier in the presentation. I'm going to quickly talk to you about what those priority goals and objectives are. And then I'll move into a discussion of what our priority learning questions are. And as I do that, I'd like you to listen for, are there areas that I'm hearing about where I have interest and expertise? Are there areas where I or others I know of have already built evidence that could be of value to policymakers and just needs to be surfaced and shared with them? And importantly, are there areas of mutually beneficial collaboration? Because per the title of my talk, evidence building in this way truly is a team sport that will require a whole ecosystem of evidence builders in partnership with government to really move the needle on evidence-based policymaking. So, as I mentioned, we have 5 strategic goals. I will not go through all of them with you, as I'll focus on the ones that are most directly relevant to today's presentation. But our first strategic goal of the department, goal number 1, is about promoting equity in student access to resources, to opportunity, and to inclusive environments. And in the vein of post-secondary education, I draw your attention to our objective 1.4, which really focuses upon adult learners and traditional age students access to high quality post-secondary opportunities that will put them on that path, that will get them on a trajectory towards employment in high demand occupations. And then in strategic goal 4, which is entirely focused on post-secondary education, you'll see we are really interested in achieving 4 objectives: learning more and doing better about supporting educational institutions and state systems to raise academic quality and college completion for all students; improving the administration of student aid programs to ensure that students receive aid, can successfully repay their loans, can receive forgiveness benefits if applicable, and can avoid default. We want to be sure that we're increasing access to pathways that really have clear connections to high quality jobs. And then finally, we want to make sure that we are aligning across systems and aligning across sectors, making sure that students of any age can move seamlessly through those sectors and systems to make sure that they are getting on a trajectory that will lead them in a high wage, good paying job. Now, as I mentioned, those strategic objectives then have a series of questions that we are seeking help, perhaps your help, in building answers to. I will not read to you all these questions verbatim. As we mentioned, you can go online to evaluation.gov and find not only the Department of Education's priority learning questions, but the questions of all federal large agencies, if education is not your primary area of focus. But I want to give you the flavor or the highlight of the things that we are most interested in learning about over the next 4 years. So on this slide, you'll see we're really interested in learning more about equitable access to post-secondary education, in engaging adult learners, and supporting seamless and cost-effective transitions between levels of education. We really want to understand more about the resources and supports and services students are already receiving and their impact upon important student outcomes, and making sure that we're learning more about how institutions who are doing the hard work of the educating, how they are being supported through resources and other services to do the work they're called to do. Then specific questions on aid. Want to know more about how it is we can be more effective in making sure students and families know about the federal student aid options they have available to them. We want to know more about the specific impact that various types of student aid have on the students' trajectories through college, and then as they leave college into the workforce and life. And then importantly, we want to be sure that we're improving the borrower experience. And then finally, a few more things to kind of put in the back of your mind as you think about our priority. We have lots of questions about how we can be more effective in student loan administration and servicing, how we can learn more about the student borrower repayment experience, and finally, how we can make sure that our student aid programs are really effectively targeted, making sure that the students who need those resources the most are receiving them. So my question to you, my charge to you is, are these topics that you share an interest in? I genuinely believe that evidence building on these questions should be a team sport. They have to be a team sport. We have more questions, we have capacity to answer them. And that team should be broad. It should include learners and educators. It should include communities and community-based organizations. It should include research that is both qualitative and quantitative. It should include local policymakers, state policymakers, and folks like me at the federal level. And it should include funders of research and education. So if you are intrigued, if you want to go on this evidence building for policymaking journey, let's talk about opportunities for how we can do that work together. So a few final thoughts. Although today we're specifically focused on building evidence of post-secondary education, if you go on evaluation.gov and read our full strategic plan, our full learning agenda, you'll see that we are interested in building evidence across the entire range of education, from pre-K all the way through adult education. If you see our learning agenda, you'll note that we have some questions that are strictly descriptive in nature, while we have others that will depend upon more experimental research, knowing about the efficacy of individual programs and policies. We're looking for the highest quality evidence that we can build. However, we also know that we are working inside a particular time window. Our policymaking opportunity is time-bound, so we're interested in right-sizing rigor. And finally, if your interests and education's interests aren't aligned, I will not be offended, but if you share my belief that there is true power in the collaboration between government and non-government researchers, then please simply reach out. I am more than glad to be an intermediary between you and my colleagues in the other federal agencies so that you can bring your expertise and your evidence building skill to bear upon the questions that they are most trying to deal with. So thank you very much. If you have any questions about this work and about the Department of Education's or any other federal agency's evidence building agenda and how we're conceptualizing of partnerships between government and researchers, don't hesitate to contact me. We're very creative here at the department with our email addresses. You can see it there on the screen. Simply send me a note, matthew.solner@ed.gov. I would love to speak with you. All right, with that, I think I will turn it over to Devin. Devin, to you.
Thanks so much. And thank you, Matthew, and everyone, particularly Director Lewis, Associate Director Dina Lewis, and the co-hosts for bringing us all together for such a critical and important topic, and for inviting me to share some of my research with you. A few years ago, I wrote a book called Land of the Free. And in that book, I talk about the ways in which the rise of student loans has an impact in erecting barriers to upward mobility for all Americans, but particularly for African Americans. And then the ways in which those barriers get erected, again, have a cascading or a knock-on effect, making home ownership more difficult, increasing debt in various phases, and really preventing intergenerational wealth creation and building. But in that book, I also talk about something called direct lending. And since it's been in the news so much recently, and as a historian, I think I can provide and add some value by having that particular conversation with this particular community. Matthew mentioned the various skills and evidence-based training we bring to this forum. And as a historian who goes into archives and do archival research to find out the origin stories of particular policies and issues and problems, I think this is one value that I bring, that famous line for Oliver Wendell Holmes, a page of history is worth a volume of logic. And in recent weeks and months, conversations about the FEL program and direct lending, we've heard a lot of volume about logic, but actually very little that's historically sort of grounded. And so I'm going to excavate some of that hidden history that's in my book, Land of the Free, which was published by Oxford University Press a couple of years ago, and I'll provide a link a bit later in the chat. And so there's a current perception that direct lending is replacing the FEL program, as if direct lending is a new invention that's untried, it's unknown in terms of the social and public costs. NPR, a recent story, and Andre listened to NPR, is called the direct lending, for instance, a sideshow to the main attraction of FEL, as if the direct lending program was some sort of upstart policy that ascended in the 2010s under the Obama administration. Attorneys general now filing suits, claiming that the FEL entities, i.e., lenders, loan servicers, are being deprived of an asset, i.e. the loan and the profits from that loan, whether interest payments and fees, deprived of an asset that it actually currently owns. But that's a bit of a false reading of the origins of the direct lending in the FEL program, this relationship with the FEL program. So I'm going to tell a bit of that history sort of right now. And perhaps at the end of this, what we'll wind up seeing in many ways is that the claims of the assets of FEL might be thought of as perhaps ill-gotten gains or fruit of a poisonous tree. And so direct lending, contrary to popular belief, is really not in terms of student lending, college student lending for post-secondary education, was really not a new idea. In fact, it was originally raised in the 1950s by a laissez-faire economist named Milton Friedman and others who were as part of the sort of National Defense Education Act. Now, Friedman's plan was to minimize bureaucracy by directly using U.S. sort of Treasury funds to help those who couldn't afford college go to college, and by removing really in many ways the middleman of bankers and loan servicers that would often increase the cost of college, so that government would reduce the service costs of loan delivery and repayment, and thereby pass those savings on to student borrowers and ultimately on to taxpayers in the form of cheaper loans. Now, this idea of the 1950s largely gets tabled and is really resurrected in the 1990s, primarily by Bill Clinton, who sees direct lending as an important component of the administration's overall deficit reduction plan. Now, direct lending, the Clinton administration pointed out, was simpler, faster, and cheaper. And I say it really starts in earnest under Clinton, at least the efforts do. But it's the germ of the idea, at least in terms of administration, comes from the Bush administration. They do a study, and in that study, the initial results of that study show or suggest, again, that direct lending is simpler, cheaper, and faster. So, again, the plan was to have direct lending as 4% of student loans in 1994, and 1995, the fiscal year, and ultimately within 4 years later to have it as 100% of student loans. There are multiple cost-benefit analyses that were done at the time about direct lending, and concluding it was a more efficient and cheaper alternative to an incentive-laden deals of the FEL program or guarantees for the student loans. Now, as you might imagine, private lenders took issue with some of these arguments. They argued, private lenders, for instance, that direct loans would deprive students and parents of the financial expertise of private lenders. They argued that financial offices were ill-prepared to handle the rush of additional expenditures in terms of personnel or equipment that might be needed. And some lenders also argued, and hinted at least, that they served a higher mission. As one student lender argued, that they were doing lending, quote, not for profit, but for students. And however, despite these concerns, direct lending, at least in a modest sort of way, went forward. And in that initial academic year, you could say, of 1994 and 1995, funds were dispersed to students in a rapid sort of way. Students receive funds from direct lending in weeks rather than months. In the first week, for instance, of 1994, 1995, for example, $13 million was dispersed to students compared to only $3 million the year before under the Guaranteed Student Loan Program. The direct program, and I should say this, when I say a small program, there's about 104 colleges and universities which were using direct lending program under the inaugural year of the program, 1994, 1995. Now, the direct program also appeared to work for universities as well. Now, rather than college financial aid offices dealing with multiple lenders and state guarantee agencies to administer and collect these student loans or to disperse them, financial aid offices dealt primarily with one federal office. And the sort of National Association for Student Financial Aid Administrators referred to the program's first year as a strong success. 90% of universities polled rated the new direct lending program 1995, 1996, quote, excellent, according to a survey by the Clinton administration at the time. Now, the next year, approximately, because the program was so effective and so successful, approximately 2,300 schools applied for the direct loan program by the start of the next school year, 1995, 1996. But only 1,500 schools were accepted because of a cap, and I'll talk more about this cap a little later, for the next round. And by 1996, direct lending had captured about 1/3 of student loan market share, cutting a sizable chunk from banks and guarantee agencies. And so what ends up happening is that, well, let me get a little bit more background. I'll sort of say this, that even many fiscal conservative Republicans at the time saw value in direct loans. Lawrence Lindsay, Republican economist serving term as the Federal Reserve Governor of Consumer Finance, explained to one Republican senator in a letter that direct lending, yes, is cheaper, so long as it's profit to be induced in the guaranteed student loan program. Why? Obviously, what we also see through these direct loans is not simply because they were cheaper, but because they were cheaper, you could sort of argue, they also maintain a lower default rate than, say, a guaranteed student loan, 7.9% default rate compared to 8.8% default rate. Lower rates of default benefited the taxpayer as well, as you well might imagine, as there were fewer losses to be covered by the government or to be written off. And so perhaps, again, most important, direct lending remained a better deal for taxpayers. Again, there were fewer administrative fees and fewer administrative costs as well. They were typically charged or tacked on by the host of private lenders, the so-called private middlemen that the federal government relied on to these guaranteed student loan programs. A guaranteed student loan at the time cost the government $12.80 for every $100 borrowed. By comparison, a direct student loan brought in 22 cents for every $100 borrowed, even after administrative costs were deducted. Even the Bush administration in 2006, this is the W. Bush administration, 2006 educational budget showed that a guaranteed student loan cost $11 more per $100 than a direct loan. But direct lending could never gain a permanent foothold. And it wouldn't be until 2010 fiscal year that direct lending, as we all know, would actually really gain sort of political favor when the Obama administration and congressional Democrats ended the failed program. So after the initial flush of interest in direct lending, guaranteed student loans quickly regained dominance. And there are three major factors why. One was because congressional Republicans became the majority. In that space, lender lobbying expanded. And then there's also a sort of a thaw in the Clintons' relationship with the GOP, which reflected in the Clinton administration's embrace of tax credits. But it's that middle issue of lender lobbying that I'm going to sort of kind of try to sort of close with here. And so in 1995, it's sort of a combination between Republican majority and lender lobbying. By 1995, the 104th Congress, the Republican majority, would actually go about basically prohibiting the education department from effectively prohibiting from requiring, even encouraging colleges to switch to direct loan programs, stopping the program in its tracks. In that space, what happened was that with basically the education department and direct lending sort of muzzled, private lenders would go about lobbying Congress, but particularly wooing financial aid officers and officers. For a safe measure, the new Republican majority passed legislation that capped the proportion of direct loans to no more than 40% of all student loans. And in this environment and space, once reluctant financial aid administrators who had earlier praised direct lending and said how much of a benefit it was for them and for the students who they serve, reconcile themselves to the fact that their new reality was predicated on a pay-to-play relationship with banks and other lenders. And so what we see is a series in a decade or more of really inducement processes from private lenders. If you look at the bulk of correspondence by the student financial aid administrators from the national office, or even from the Office of Middle Atlantic's Middle America sort of states, they go about dedicating a bulk of their correspondence to thanking major lenders like PNC, Bank One, Chemical, Fifth Third, U.S. Bancorp, and others for sponsoring workshops and institutes and functions for their trade organization. Major lenders also appointed university officials to ad hoc committees, flew them first class to retreats, to swanky hotels, to golf resorts, and gave them concert tickets or tickets to sporting events. As the financial aid officer at Johns Hopkins once said, there's, quote, an endless stream of invitations offered to her by lenders. In addition to these junkets, lenders also offered enticements or inducements to resource-poor colleges that were desperate need of goods and services, particularly HBCUs. One lender, for example, promised to provide a financial aid office at Tuskegee University, quote, free loan counseling, computer software, and temporary employees to help reduce the workload of financial aid office. Again, the goal was to provide these inducements to make their lender the preferred lender for that university. And I write about this in another publication where there's a decade or more of inducements. And in that process, what they try to do is they ultimately wound up increasing the cost of these loans and these loan sort of products. So I'm going to sort of close right here by saying that the guaranteed student loan industry has successfully sort of stemmed the once rising tide of direct lending, and thus ultimately consigning students to more expensive financial products and costing taxpayers more money. And this is basically what happens over the last sort of generation or two. And so the cost of the loans that students are now incurred today, that are these conversations are now winding up in court, are so inflated because of this longer history of the guaranteed student loan industries basically using these inducements and crowding out direct lending. That's the longer history, which is often missed and ignored in current policy and public discussions. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
It is an absolute delight to be here today and to be part of this distinguished group of speakers. I am going to shift focus a bit to talk about not necessarily the individual students, but the universities and colleges that they attend. The past half century has brought dramatic and well-documented reductions in public commitments to higher education in the US. Competition between colleges and universities for private revenue streams, for example, tuition grants, philanthropic investments, and corporate sponsorship, has escalated in part to compensate for lost governmental support. But, and this is my central point today, defunding has not hit all colleges and universities evenly, as resource and status allocation fall along racial and class lines. Schools that offer access tend to have far less robust private revenue streams. The result is what some have referred to as separate and unequal system of higher education, in which students from low-income households who are disproportionately racially marginalized attend resource-poor post-secondary schools. In Broke, The Racial Consequences of Underfunding Public Universities, my co-author and I document the consequences of public funding cuts on schools serving large percentages of marginalized students. Now, the book uses the venerated University of California system as a test case, but the patterns in California and in the UC are widely applicable. As this slide shows, there have been sharp decreases in the share of state funding for California's four-year university systems. I want you to note the very clear and opposing relationship to corrections funding in the state. This is in part why I often emphasize the voluntary aspect of fiscal austerity. Governments at both state and federal levels choose where and how to invest, and there has been a move away from funding higher education. Indeed, as we discussed earlier today, in Illinois, there has been a sharp decrease in the percentage of public university revenue provided by the state over the last 30 years. So to make ends meet in Illinois and elsewhere, universities will increase tuition and fees. As a result, Illinois' average tuition and fees for in-state students were the fourth highest in the US in the 2020-2021 school year. Now, Broke points out that defunding has not occurred evenly. Our focal schools in the book are my university, University of California, Merced, and University of California, Riverside. These two schools do the lion's share of work with marginalized student populations for the UC system. Both schools are majority Latinx and majority low income, and both schools have very little access to sources of private revenue that universities use to compensate for state disinvestment. Indeed, Merced's foundation receives less than 1% of the private support that Berkeley's foundation takes in a given year. This pattern is not just restricted to the UC system or California. University wealth is nationally concentrated at schools that serve very few numbers of marginalized students. The gaps by student race are in fact larger than the gaps by student class. So you can see in this graph, endowment dollars per student by student race at four-year publics across the nation. In the mid-1980s, the endowment dollars per student were very similar regardless of student race. Over time, as post-secondary schools came to rely more and more on private funding sources, disparities sharpened, so that Asian and white students are located at resource-rich schools, and Latinx, Black, and Indigenous students are enrolled in schools where there are fewer endowment dollars per student. If I had data that broke down the Asian category into subgroups, you would also see underrepresented Southeast Asian groups, such as Hmong, Laotian, Cambodian, and Vietnamese students attending under-resourced schools with Black and Latinx students. So the overall pattern for Asian students here can be a bit misleading. Now, endowment dollars are just one measure of institutional resources. A recent report by the Institute for College Access and Success indicates that predominantly Latinx institutions, those that are over 40% Latinx, received nearly $4,300 less in per student revenue than similar peer institutions. And by peer institutions, I mean schools that are similarly structured where the main difference is who attends. The gap between spending on Black and white students in four-year colleges and universities is also substantial, particularly in some states, as you can see here. There is a massive 26% percentage point difference in spending per Black college student in California, due in part to the fact that Black students attend different colleges and universities than their racially privileged peers, schools that receive less funding. The chronic underfunding of racially disadvantaged students relative to racially advantaged students has been described by some scholars as troublingly reminiscent of redlining. Redlining is a series of discriminatory practices that systematically deny public services or support to residents of certain areas based on their race and ethnicity. The term is most commonly used to refer to the fact that areas where Black residents lived were deemed risky investments, making it hard for Black families and individuals to obtain mortgages or other types of loans. The redlining metaphor is fitting for today's post-secondary system, as colleges and universities that serve marginalized students routinely and systematically have more limited access to funding and resources. Schools serving disadvantaged students are often treated like red line neighborhoods, and that they have less access to various forms of financial support. These schools take hits in both status and ranking calculations, calculations that often determine access to private revenue. They may also receive less resources from the state. Universities that work with marginalized populations are being literally starved for resources. Leadership have clear-eyed goals about meeting student needs that can run into really hard fiscal realities. Now, I know most schools have faced decades of austerity and have been hit hard by COVID-19, but what these schools are facing is distinct. In Broke, for example, we document the on-the-ground consequences of institutional wealth gaps for vibrant, sharp, and driven Latinx and Black youth from low-income families. We describe classrooms with broken furniture, missing ceiling tiles, dust-encrusted air vents, wires coming out of walls, floors covered with dirty footprints and leaves, filthy desks and chairs. We see academic advisors with caseloads of 750 students per advisor, more than double that of the national average. We find that counseling services, even for urgent cases, have a 3-month wait. These kind of disparities are deeply troubling. So how should we respond? One solution is to focus on getting more support to individual racially marginalized students and families. Currently, calculations of financial need are based heavily on income, not on family wealth. And as we know and have heard today, access to wealth in the US is heavily racialized. Even students of color whose families might look middle class do not have the same assets as the average white middle class family. The HERE Lab at UC Merced is currently working on a project exploring the possibility of allowing for negative discretionary wealth in calculations of student need. There are a few ways to do this, even relying only on existing FAFSA data. By accounting for the lack of familial wealth among Black, Latinx, and Indigenous families in the US, we can make visible needs that are currently not visible with income-based formulas. This should result in greater access to financial support for college among racially marginalized families. Most immediately, however, is the fact that the current funding model for public higher education penalizes schools that serve larger numbers of racially marginalized students, as these schools cannot compete for compensatory public or compensatory private funds. The most equitable historical moments of public higher education have been those in which our public post-secondary systems were heavily funded by the public. In the face of defunding, university reliance on private resources exacerbates both segregation and organizational resource disparities. We must consider ways to invest in higher education again and to channel substantial supports to universities serving marginalized students. Now, many different proposals have offered blueprints to do this, even without additional spending. For instance, by not allowing federal funding to go to for-profit colleges and universities, or to the programs that former for-profits now quietly run at public universities. Investing in higher education means investing in regions and communities, in green technology, in the science of climate change and pandemics. It means increasing voter turnout and volunteer service for communities in need. Higher education is one hub for much of what we care about in a functioning society moving into the future. Thank you very much. And I'm going to now go ahead and turn it to Dr. Louise Seamster.
Thank you. And I'm honored to be here today with all these illustrious panelists, and thank you to the IRRPP and the CTPA for having me on again to discuss their important, follow up on their important reports, and especially Amanda Lewis for the opportunity to come talk today about the interplay of student debt and the racial wealth gap and the chance for rethinking social policy along these lines. So I've been working in the area of student debt and debt generally for a number of years, including work beginning in 2019, working with a team to help work on Senator Warren's proposal to cancel student debt. We designed, as requested by Senator Warren, we designed that policy based on assessing different amounts of cancellation in light of the impact on the racial wealth gap. And so that was a very interesting experience in terms of putting the racial wealth gap in the forefront of assessing a given social policy, and was a really interesting opportunity for me to get to see what it's like to apply evidence-based policy as a social scientist directly for material policymaking, and to foreground racial equity in that. And today I wanted to talk about some recommendations grounded in policy analysis by myself and by others, but I'm intentionally going broader, as Professor Hamilton just left off, to recommend maybe more of an overall approach, the structural approach that she mentioned, concluded with, to guide policy making in general rather than making specific policy recommendations today. Because I would argue that a value of social science extends beyond our data collection and analysis, but in terms of theory building as well. My line of research in this area started by trying to explain what could have made Black wealth drop by half in the 5 years around the Great Recession. And that led me and my co-author, Raf Sharon-Chenier, to look at the recent rise of Black student debt, which was an outlier in this period. And we've found that where median student debt levels doubled since 2001, that Black student debt levels went up fourfold in that time, so less than 20 years. And in working to contextualize that finding, I've looked at how debt works differently for Black and white families and how that relates to racial wealth differences, and how the fact that we are relying more and more on debt for basic elements of social provision, as Abby Atkinson has pointed out, has dire consequences for racial inequality, and even we could argue for our democracy. So we have our major pathways that we're supposed to have for accruing wealth in this country, from buying a house to going to college, run through debt. But we've seen from these state level reports and the research shared today that debt works very differently for white families and Black and brown families. And we have a vicious cycle where intergenerational differences in wealth shape both your debt assumption and your ability to pay it down afterwards. And because of that divergence, Black borrowers in particular end up paying much more on their debt for a much longer time. And that's definitionally a regressive system where I would argue that debt-financed higher education will never close the racial wealth gap. And in fact, we find the opposite, where if the racial wealth gap overall means a median white family has $10 of wealth for every dollar in wealth of a Black family, in our recent paper on student debt cancellation, we actually find that this is much worse for borrowers, comparing to borrowers, that the wealth gap for the median white family with student debt, they have $20 in wealth for every dollar in wealth for a Black family with student debt. This is a recently developed problem, but without drastic intervention, such as the student debt cancellation policy that Biden's enacting and related additional interventions, we were going to have dire and long-term results. So my co-author, Raf, and I call this system of differential burden and higher costs and lower returns for Black and brown students predatory inclusion, which we define as giving marginalized people access to a benefit they were formerly excluded from, but on terms that negate the benefit. So we've seen a shift in higher education, as several panelists have pointed out today, from a system that was relatively restricted in access, but also relatively affordable, to a system that is technically more open to women, to people of color, but on terms that negate that benefit. So just as predatory mortgages prior to the Great Recession took advantage of Black and Latinx homeowners wanting a piece of the American dream, we argue the evidence on student debt shows the same type of predatory inclusion is now happening in that sector, but without being able to be canceled through bankruptcy. And this isn't a matter that families can solve on their own through smart cost comparison or the right type of penny pinching or decision making. This is a policy matter. And I really appreciate this focus today on the shifts in burdens from federal and state level funding to student financed higher education. And when we look at potential changes to that financing system, I want to take this opportunity to recommend moving away from policies that focus on increasing financial aid or aiding affordability, as opposed to rethinking that balance of costs. To rethink how states and the federal system are increasingly relying on students to carry the burden of funding public education. Because I argue this shift has corrosive broader effects on our democracy. We already have a pretty good system, after all, by which people who do well economically pay back some of that return over a lifetime. We call them taxes. And the difference between a tax on your increased earnings and a debt payment on public services you've received is an important conceptual one. By buying into students as revenue generators, we've walked away from offering a public service. We should consider the consequences of funding institutions upfront for all versus offering aid for a few who have to prove their eligibility. We've seen this model shift over time from a public good, a discussion around education, to discussions where we're concerned about people potentially getting a public benefit for free. And we don't talk about this for K-12 education, at least not yet. But the increasing shift to burdening individuals with the cost of public higher ed is sold by a story saying that higher education is how individuals get ahead. But we're encouraging people to gamble on their future with debt and using the existence of the lottery, and some people do win the lottery, to justify cuts to other areas of social spending. So if you want security for yourself and your family, you're expected to go to college. And we act as if the primary benefit of going to college is individually based, so through increased earnings, for instance. But I'm going to state the obvious and say that we also need higher education at a societal level. We need teachers, nurses, and doctors. We need engineers and policy analysts, and we even need artists and historians and social scientists. The pitch is that college is the American dream comes hand in hand with this revenue shift to the shoulders of students. And a different pitch would return to that public mission of funding public higher education to avoid these debt traps that ultimately cost us more, as Professor Fergus indicated, and artificially restrict our options. So I also want to emphasize that when we're thinking about solutions to higher education, that often we can go to social policies that go beyond higher education or exist completely outside of it. Because canceling student debt alone will hardly move the needle on the racial wealth gap overall, because that gap is so large. But we see debt cancellation as a necessary precondition for closing that racial wealth gap, but that it should come alongside policies that rebuild our social safety net so that it's no longer so essential or such a matter of life and death to try to attend and complete college. We need policies that support people from birth to death, whether that's increased minimum wage or free healthcare or guaranteed housing. Because right now, higher ed is made to perform, and it's not performing well as the safety net and pressure valve for our economic system. And the solutions to higher ed, therefore, lie in part in policies outside of higher education itself. Those policies can help build wealth, but more importantly, they'll offer people the security and stability that wealth is supposed to offer. And I would say that while this seems kind of large scale, I've learned from my work over the past few years that the scope of our policy proposals is far less limited than I would have originally realized before I realized that we could just propose canceling student debt and make it a reality. And that I really want us to take heart from that in terms of our power, especially when we work together as academics and advocates and community groups and policymakers to think about, well, what is the scope of what's possible? Why are we doing it a certain way? What has been the effect? And how could we think bigger to do things differently? Thanks a lot.
Wonderful. So while I'm sorry we can't have a discussion because we are over time, I am glad that all of our speakers were able to share their brilliant insights with us. Audience members, you have or will have contact information for our scholars, and we will be posting the video in 2 or 3 weeks so that you can refer back to the important information shared today. Very briefly, I would like to thank our co-hosts, CTBA, especially with a special thank you to Allison Flanagan and Sarah Wasick, the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy. Again, special thank you to Christina Chaka-Eller, Diana Epstein, and Miriam Goulad. And also to our speakers, Ralph Martiri, Amanda Lewis, Fructoso Basildua, Matthew Soldner, Devin Fergus, Laura Hamilton, and Louise Seamster. Thank you so much and have a great day.